Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for taking the time early this morning to come to this discussion of the United Nations and Multilateral Development Bank's Partnership for Success, Reforming the Multilateral Architecture to Achieve the SDGs. My name is Sarah Burke. I'm a policy analyst with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, and we are going to be hearing this morning from our panel, Ms. Svenja Schulze, the Federal Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development of Germany. We'll be hearing from Mr. Achim Steiner, Administrator for the UN Development Program, from Ms. Anna Bierda, Managing Director of Operations for the World Bank, and from Mr. Richard Gowan, the UN Director for the International Crisis Group. But first, I would like to introduce Michael Broning, the Executive Director for Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in New York, to talk about the global census. And you have a sheet on every table with a QR code, and Michael will tell you more about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. I think you all deserve an extra hand of applause for making it here this early. I hope you're well stocked with coffee. So thanks to our panelists who also took the time out of their busy schedule to be with us this morning. We really appreciate it. Thanks for being with us, to all of you. Ladies and gentlemen, we are all aware that these days there's no shortage of doom and gloom. We had a hottest summer on record. The UN General Secretary said we had reached the point of boiling. As we speak, tanks are rolling through Europe. There's a resurgence of great power conflict. And of course, we know that we are nowhere near on track with the SDGs. Now, we all know that diplomacy can sometimes be detached from ordinary people and ordinary citizens. And at the same time, of course, it's ordinary citizens and ordinary people who suffer the most when diplomacy fails. This is the reason why we are pleased to officially launch today our 4th annual FES Global Census, a multinational survey studying public opinion on key issues of international cooperation. Conducted in partnership with YouGov, we asked 15,000 people on 5 continents some very tricky questions about the United Nations, about global cooperation, about multilateralism. And to be quite honest with you, some of the results were quite surprising. We are happy to share the results with you, as Sarah said. Please just scan the QR code. The most important finding, and to me the most surprising finding, was that in many ways support for the UN and other international organizations has not collapsed in the last year, despite the global tensions. It remains remarkably high, despite the crises. In fact, the perception of the UN has improved when we compare it to previous rounds of our survey. For example, in Argentina, Germany, and India, and even here in the US, support for the UN is clearly up. And even more notably, support for the SDGs is almost unanimous. In short, there's no such thing as a popular revolt against the SDGs or the Agenda 2030. And if there is opposition, that opposition is anything but popular. Instead, there's 96% support, for example, in Kenya, 80% support in the UK, and 70% support in Brazil. Perhaps also surprisingly, many respondents in the Global South believe that the SDGs are not only important, but they are also optimistic that they can actually be implemented and that they will be achieved. For example, in Indonesia, 71% of respondents say that the SDGs are likely to be met. In India, 66% of respondents share this belief. This is the kind of optimism that we cannot and must not let down. At the same time, of course, many respondents doubt that the existing UN system is well prepared for the challenges of the future. And this perception is most widely shared in the Global North, where respondents feel that the UN simply isn't ready for the task at hand. And this is by a 23% point margin in France, a 24% point margin in Germany, and an 18-point margin in Japan. Now, UN reform proposals, particularly regarding the UN Security Council, are strongly supported by majorities in all 15 countries that we surveyed. And even in countries holding a permanent seat at the Council, support for the current setup is anything but widespread. Now, the picture that emerges in a nutshell is people want stronger United Nations, they support the SDGs, and they want reforms so that words can finally turn into action. It's my hope that when we join the political and the diplomatic conversation in the coming days, we remember that we are here by popular demand. Yes, to shake hands, to smile into the cameras, but first and foremost, to get things done. Thank you very much, and I wish you all a very productive week ahead.
Thank you very much, Michael. And now I would like to invite Minister Schulze to give the keynote address.
Good morning to everybody. Good morning, and thank you for being here so early in the morning. And first of all, I would like to thank the Ford Foundation Center for Social Justice for hosting us in this beautiful building with this view in the morning. Thank you very much for that. It was 50 years ago yesterday, on the 18th September of 1973, that the Federal Republic of Germany and the former German Democratic Republic joined the United Nations. And today, Germany is one of the most active supporters of the United Nations. And I stand before you as a convinced multilateralist. In today's world, a rule-based and international order and a joint action are more important than ever. And at the same time, multilateralism needs an update. The world has changed massively in the last 50 years. As an international community, we are much more aware just how limited our resources are. And that growth alone will not solve the problems of poverty and inequality. Progressing climate change, the loss of biodiversity, and the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic are showing us very, very clearly that the great challenges of our time are intertwined, that they are interdependent. And they do not stop at national borders. They are a threat not only to development progress in individual countries, but also to global stability as such. And that is why it is all the more important that we address these challenges together. The multilateral institutions need to respond to these complex situations. They have to reinvent themselves and refocus their work. That is the only way for us, the international community, to tackle these challenges effectively and get the goals of the 2030 agenda back on track. UN Secretary Antonio Guterres launched our common agenda in recognition of these developments, and the first steps have been taken in the right direction. Germany is supporting the Secretary General's reform agenda. The summit of the future must result in an agreement on concrete steps for making cooperation within the international community even closer and more effective. But it is not only about the United Nations. The entire multilateral systems need to be reformed and strengthened. This includes the international development finance institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the regional development banks. They, too, need to bring to life and advance an inclusive, networked, and effective multilateralism. The multilateral financial institutions play a central role in closing the financing gap for the SDGs. The international community is experiencing multiple overlapping crises. Governments worldwide are facing tough decisions because of current inflation rates. Should they borrow fresh money to be able to make investments that are urgently needed to fight poverty and inequality, or should they, against the backdrop of tight budgets, forego these investments, even if this may worsen the climate crisis or delay important reforms. Ladies and gentlemen, as the international community, we must not leave any countries to struggle alone with this dilemma. We must not allow crises and debt to kill the SDGs and the climate. It is all the more important now that fundamental reforms are launched, so it is time for the multilateral financial institutions to contribute more to ensure that the right investments are made. Investments that enhance global crises and resilience, investments that set the course for a world that is fairer, safer, and sustainable. It is against this backdrop that I have initiated a reform of the World Bank together with other shareholders. The aim is to reinvent the bank and make it a true transformation bank. This will require the bank to focus on its lending much more on the protection and provision of global public goods, climate protection and adaptation to climate change, biodiversity conservation, pandemic preparedness, and enhancing resilience, for instance, through investing in social protection. I welcome that under President Banga's leadership, the World Bank is stressing the importance of a livable planet in its vision. It is important now to gear the entire business model and the instruments of the World Bank towards promoting sustainability and resilience. And I count on all stakeholders to agree at the annual meeting in Marrakesh next month on an ambitious World Bank reform and give the starting signal for its implementation. The African Climate Summit that was held in Nairobi 2 weeks ago showed that many countries in Africa are ready to do more for the global energy transition and to address climate change. They presented concrete initiatives, and they are calling for better access to finance from the international finance systems, and rightly so. Joseph Ngaga, the CEO of the African Summit, put its finger on the main point, and I like to quote him. He said, Africa has the resources and the world has the money and the technology. And Germany supports this demand to more assistance and innovative financing approaches. And like many other countries of the Global South, we also stress that the World Bank's increased focus on the protecting of global public goods must not be realized at the expense of the poorest countries. Quite the opposite. The German government is working for the World Bank to address poverty reduction and the protection of global public goods more systematically and in a joint approach. We want the bank to use its funds in the best possible way and create more concessionality without jeopardizing its rating. It needs to use its funds more flexibly so that synergies and the right incentives are created for policy reforms and sustainable investments. And it needs to contribute to mobilizing more private investments for social and environmental transformation, because only this will close the financing gap. Germany is ready to further strengthen a reformed bank also in financial terms. We've just discussed about a better bank, and now we need to discuss about a bigger bank. As announced at the G20 meeting in Delhi, Germany is prepared to buy 305 million euros worth of hybrid capital from the World Bank, and this will help the bank mobilize up to 2.4 billion euros for investments in global public goods. And I call on other countries to join Germany in using this new innovative financing modality. But it is also clear that the World Bank cannot ensure the protection and provision of global public goods alone. The entire system of multilateral development banks needs to rise to these challenges. And that is why the German government welcomes that the G20 have called for the multilateral development banks to operate much more as one system. They all need to foster the protection of public goods. They need to develop joint standards and criteria for support and contribute their respective strengths. It is also important that debt sustainability analyses take greater account of climate investment and climate vulnerability. Innovations such as debt pauses during acute climate shocks are a step in the right direction. Debt must not be an obstacle of climate action and investment in sustainability. And I'm therefore a strong advocate of debt for climate swaps and debt for nature swaps. In order to get the SDGs back on track, we need this kind of innovative approaches, and we need all hands on deck. And that is why I support the vision of a development partnership across systems, a partnership that dovetails the work of the International Development Finance Institution more closely with the United Nations. And in order to reach the goals of the 2030 agenda, they need to systematically share knowledge, engaged in joint agenda setting, and launch joint financing. And I'm calling for the United Nations to be granted permanent observer status on the board of the World Bank so as to translate this vision into reality. And as you can see, there are plenty of ways to partner for success and plenty of good starting points and levers to reform the multilateral architecture. The current geopolitical tensions in our multipolar world are certainly not making structural reforms any easier. However, I am firmly convinced that strong, networked multilateral organizations are in the interest of all countries of the world. To foster the global dialogue on how to best advance structural reforms and the SDGs, UNDP and Germany will be convening the Hamburg Sustainability Conference in June next year. The conference will bring together thought leaders from politics, the private sector, and civil society to put forward successful approaches in preparation of the summit of the future. But now, I'm eager to hear your ideas and look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much for being here and joining this discussion.
Thank you so much, Minister, for this vision of a bigger and better, more networked and more integrated multilateral system. I'd now like to invite the entire panel to join me on the podium. And perhaps you could sit here or in the middle. Yeah, wherever you'd like. Okay. And I understand, yeah, you need to leave at 8:15. So after that vision, we have a few questions. You mentioned, Minister Schulze, that we are in the context of multiple overlapping, cascading crises. So in the context of this polycrisis moment, and I address this to each of the panelists, which reforms to the multilateral architecture are needed now to mitigate crises on sustainable development and to get the SDGs back on track? Ms. Beardje, I'd like to begin with you and then move down the panel.
Thank you so very much. And let me also join Minister Schulze and wishing you a very good morning and for thanking you for being here. And I'd also like to very much express my appreciation on behalf of the World Bank to the German government and to the minister personally for the leadership at this very pivotal time as we are trying to really refocus so that we can get into a much better shape to meet the challenges that we're facing. So thank you so much. Let me just, as you ask this question, step back and mention maybe three things that kind of keep me awake at night as I go to bed every night and as I wake up in the morning. The first one is data that we just released, which is that by the end of 2024, we estimate that people in 30% of developing countries, so 1/3 of developing countries, will be poorer than they were before COVID. So that's 30% of countries, 1/3 of developing countries, people in these big part of the world will actually have greater poverty than they did before COVID. And this is not easy to address. The second thing that keeps me awake is learning losses. We were not great before COVID. About 57% of 10-year-olds around the world had challenges reading a story and fully comprehending it. After COVID, our estimates put that number at 70. That's 7 out of 10 10-year-olds in low and middle income countries have problems reading a text, age appropriate, and being able to fully understand it. This is a crisis in my view. And in the lowest countries in the world, that number is 9 out of 10 kids. So this is devastating. The third factor that keeps me awake is that development aid has really shifted away from the most vulnerable countries. So add on top of that the learning losses, add on top of that that poverty has gone up. We have a big problem. And add to that the fact that we're not on track to meet the very, very vital SDGs, and that trillions of dollars are really needed to go into emerging and developing countries, emerging markets and developing countries. So what do we need to do about it? Minister Schultz said it very well. We need to become better. We need to become bigger. And we do need to work on both. And I want to talk a little bit about what the World Bank is doing on both. On the better side, we have launched a year ago at the request of our shareholders, and again, Germany's been absolutely instrumental on this, put the question to us to say, we entered what we call an evolution journey. We need to change. And on the better part, we looked really at 3 different dimensions. We need to be able to, also as the minister said, bring together the global challenges that the world faces with what we see at the country level. Many of the global challenges are also country-level challenges, and many of the country-level challenges spread across boundaries. So this issue that you can work on global at one level and local on another is actually blurring and kind of going away, and we need to work on them together. And for us to do that, we need to better define what are those major global challenges that we need to work on. So our president came in, and I think actually on day 5 or so, day 7 maybe, Michael, he presented to our board a new vision and a new mission. And this new vision and mission takes us from what we keep doing, of course, very much focused on extreme poverty elimination, sharing of prosperity, which is really raising everybody up, to adding on a livable planet. And this is fundamentally shifting us to focus both on people, fundamental, but also the planet we live on. So bringing those two together, very important. And then what I'm working on as operational managing director is, in order to implement this and make it real, we need to focus on 3 things operationally with our clients. Speed, we're frankly too slow. If we're lucky, it takes less than 10 years to go from an initial discussion of a project to the full implementation, if we're lucky, because there are so many issues in design, in execution, in implementation, in effectiveness. If we're unlucky, well, it's above 10 years. So we need to speed up preparation of projects, and we need to speed up also the implementation of projects. This has a lot of issues related to it of bureaucracy and cutting out bureaucratic steps, but it also has a lot to do with my second big priority, which is to actually build capacity with our clients. We've gotten away from this. We've assumed a bit that it's there. And I think here it's becoming increasingly challenging because we're also operating in more complex settings. So another thing that's very much on my mind is the increase in fragility in the world, increase in conflict in the world. And when you're operating, I'm just back from Chad, when you're operating in environments like this, you cannot assume that your strong, good policies and procedures are fully absorbed. You need to spend time investing, and I think very important, build on clients' own capacity. And of course, strengthen it through your support and your technical assistance. I call it start by meeting your client where they are and then build up, rather than come in and say, this is what is required, and build that. I don't like that approach, but this is a major shift in how we work. And then finally, scale. We need to be able to go to scale, build on successful examples, use instruments that we're able to go deeper in a country using or go across countries in a using. So speed, capacity, scale. This is operationally what we're very much focused on. And then on the bigger bank, the minister mentioned it, we have really gone through all of the recommendations of the capital adequacy framework, and I think we have done, if I may say, a pretty good job at laying out what we can do, and we can do a lot. We mentioned hybrid capital, and I'm so grateful to Germany for being actually the first to come out, and now others are starting to look at this. We also are putting up a platform of guarantees, lots of interest. I know Sweden is also looking at some of these, and we appreciate it because guarantees allows us to do more. We're also looking at our own balance sheet of what we can do, which is important. And then finally, at some point, we would like to also talk about a bigger bank in terms of a stronger capital base of the institution. But better exhaust all the opportunities we can do through innovation, and then let's continue to have the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You need to go first because
I would like to ask Mr. Steiner, to achieve the SDGs, there has to be better and more intensified cooperation between the UN and the World Bank. So what is required to leverage the comparative advantages of both institutions?
Thank you, and I'm not jumping the queue, but unfortunately, as you know, there's a little event happening across the street, and some of us are required to, man the doors or help people to come in. Very quickly, I think I want to start where Anna also began. What in a sense, gets me up in the morning, so to speak, is that we actually have an agenda that we call the 2030 Agenda, the SDGs, whether in the bank, in the multilateral development banks, in the UN, but also, as the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung report just showed, in many countries actually resonates very well. And, much of what we tried to do over the last 2-3 days here in New York is to remind the world that the setbacks we have suffered, the targets and indicators that we have not been able to meet, are not the product of a, flawed design or a missing consensus around what needs to be done. It's the product of a pandemic, it's the product of wars, it's the product of a financial crisis, and it's a product of essentially a debt crisis now that has fiscally drained the life out of any LDC government's ability to actually invest in a recovery. So let's be very clear, the declaration yesterday, the events on Saturday and Sunday, I think were living proof that the SDGs are alive and kicking, but struggling. And that keeps me, in a sense, getting up in the morning with some sense of optimism. Secondly, I think we also, particularly since the question is also, multilateral development banks, the UN system, I think what we have to recognize is that we are still too often cooperating by default rather than by design. By default, I mean when there are crises, when there are disasters, when there are humanitarian crises, the UN, the World Bank, the Asian Development, African Development Bank, we find a way in which we can deploy together. And I can certainly speak to that with great conviction. Our cooperation in Yemen, for example, with the World Bank is critical to enabling the UN to continue to work together with our sister agencies, be it UNICEF or WFP. And I think that obviously demonstrates that our systems are capable of coming together. What Anna knows, and I have often raised this also in our discussions, we took our senior management team to Washington a few months ago, is that I would like to see more cooperation by design. Let me give you a couple of examples. At this fiscally very challenging moment, many countries simply don't know where to look for finance and funding. So the UN has put a platform together, and UNDP is one of its key implementers of supporting countries with these integrated national financing frameworks. Acronyms are not very helpful, but they're called INFFs in case you want to remember. But by now, 86 countries have invited the UN, and UNDP, with its presence in countries, is often leading that effort with our sister agencies, but also collaborating with the bank in 40 countries, with the IMF in about 30, with the African Development Bank in about 20, simply in assisting countries to have a stocktake of what kind of finance can they mobilize, domestically, internationally, public, private, concessional, in order to even have an ability to make decisions about where to invest first, and frankly to do what a hospital doctor does in the triage, namely, what are we not going to invest in? The situation right now is very serious. For many LDCs, they spend more on their interest payments right now, 1.4 times actually on average, than on their health sector. This is a terrible moment. And that is why the SDGs are so important, because they are a clarion call not as a developing country agenda. Let me remind all of us the 2030 agenda is about 193 countries. The decisions they make or not make, the willingness to invest in one another or to walk away from one another. And frankly, you'd be forgiven for thinking that there's a lot of walking away from one another right now. So this summit yesterday, but also the continued calls by the Secretary General, for example, the SDG stimulus package, is a critical way of reminding and focusing the world on what actually matters in the next year or two. And that is finance, funding, yes, money. And I often find it difficult to understand why, in our public discourse, we find it so difficult to recreate the moments that we have seen in history before. I've quoted in recent times often the Marshall Plan. What made it possible in a country that had just become the victor of the Second World War for a president to ask taxpayers to put a Marshall Plan together that mobilized in today's money $135 billion to help the people you just spent years fighting and defeating to actually recover? We lack that wisdom at the moment. We think that somehow it's the developing world's fault that it didn't cope well enough with COVID. It's their wars, it's their bad governance, and so the narrative becomes in our public sphere one of almost, having a reason to not step up. N.K. Singh and Larry Summers just produced a report for the G20 summit that India presided over. They put another figure on. We need roughly $3 trillion a year to recover the momentum around the SDGs. And you can just see how eyebrows go up, finance ministers go pale, and sweat pearls develop. And, that was exactly what happened around that table. I sit on that table on behalf of the UN. But, the extraordinary thing is people don't read what is actually written in there. First of all, $2 trillion of that financing will come from within countries. This is also a task for governments. It has to do with taxation systems, anti-corruption, institutional efficiency, and $1 trillion should come from the international community. And again, not just the World Bank or, ODA and BMZ, but actually from private sector investments. And here I end by saying that why should the bank and the UN family, but also particularly from my vantage point, UNDP, work more closely together with the MDBs? Because much of our work every day as UNDP is in fact to create the conditions within which these kinds of investments can happen. Institutional effectiveness, governance frameworks, regulatory frameworks, essentially de-risking the ability of international finance to land not just in the countries where you can easily have your balance sheet look healthy because people repay their loans. A reminder, Africa has received less than 3% of total investment in renewable energy infrastructure at a global level. Less than 3%, the continent that will connect 1 billion people to its electricity grid in the next 20 years. And then we expect Africa to somehow pivot into this low-carbon, net-zero future when they are actually not even able to borrow money on capital markets, many countries right now, because of the interest rates. So that is one area where I think the bank and the banks need to work together. And in fact, with the African Development Bank, we have a wonderful collaboration right now. Our biggest commitment as UNDP, 21 countries, mini-grid solar programs that over the next few years will create investment opportunities to the tune of $65 billion with private sector investment, concessional funding, and lending. And you know what? It could connect 265 million citizens on the African continent to an electricity supply for the first time. And we know that electricity is the single most vital variable to change a development trajectory in terms of what history has shown us, and now with climate change, the trajectory also with clean energy. Digital is another example, digital public infrastructure. And here is something to celebrate, and I end on a good number. We often talk about the failures. Do you know that in 2005, we had barely 1 billion people able to access the internet? When the SDGs were adopted in 2015, it was around 3.1 billion people. Last year, we passed the 5.3 billion mark. In these years of failures, setbacks, and everything going wrong, we actually have 2 billion additional people being able to access the internet. Nobody ever talks about that because the successes are somehow taken for granted and the failures are used by many for many different reasons to somehow talk down what we have agreed on in 2015. And that was, as the then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon called it, a declaration of interdependence. That is the core idea behind the 2030 agenda. That is what the SDGs are actually advocating for. And that is the idea that I think we as institutions, as leaders in this field, have to take back into the public arena. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And since we're going to be losing you, Mr. Steiner, if I can quickly follow up, for this vision, where does the Pact for the Future specifically, what is the role of the Pact for the Future in moving the institutions forward together to be bigger and better and more networked and integrated?
You know, in some ways it's a catch-22. Many people say, and I think that's why the report by the Friedrich Hebert Foundation is very interesting, that our institutions are in some ways entrapped in anachronisms, in designs from another era. So what I think the Secretary General with the summit is intending to do is essentially bring the member states to the table and say, this is your institution, now reform it and redesign its ability to operate in order to meet the needs of our time. And as you can imagine, with 193 member states, first of all, if the departure point remains, well, if that is adopted, then that's in the interest of that group, so I will not support it. This is the atmosphere right now. Let's be very clear. The geopolitical atmosphere is about confrontation, about competition, and then maybe in selected areas about cooperation. This is what is actually killing the spirit that would allow institutions, whether it's the MDBs now, whether it's the UN system, to actually be reformed. So we have to come back around the table, and I think this is what the Secretary General is trying to signal against all odds. If you continue to simply define our common future in terms of a zero-sum game, you're not only going to kill these institutions, you're actually going to paralyze the world from acting. It's on climate change, on pandemic preparedness, on cybercrime, and so on. And I think the summit does not have a magic formula, and some people will focus on the Security Council. I often sit here in New York and find it quite interesting that 90% of the political energy is invested into the Security Council, the most dysfunctional element of the United Nations, which, by the way, only transacts on about maybe 15 or 20 countries in a year. The UN development system every day is present in 180 countries, working with probably 8 billion people or 7.5 billion people in one form or another, and is actually equally providing, through the United Nations, an extraordinary service to the global community. But you see, that part of the agenda, because in part we are so atomized, we have so many entities in the system, because it is also rated in foreign policy think tanks and, you know, in the ministries of defense and in the advisors to heads of state, as essentially secondary. And I think this is a tragic error in our time. And this is the concept of human security that some of you may remember that the UNDP Human Development Report once articulated. We will not succeed to defend our respective futures by having armies all over the world fighting each other. Yes, sometimes defense with a defense force is necessary, but I would still argue that for every dollar that we increase defense budgets, we should equally increase the budgets for international cooperation. When these two things are happening together, maybe we will get to an age where security becomes again something to be hopeful about, rather than simply threatening our own future with a scenario of the enemy from outside. And please remember, OECD countries at the moment do not invest more collectively than 0.36% of their GDP. Do we really believe we can have an energy revolution, we can eradicate poverty, we can prevent the next pandemic, we can advance the digital revolution, we can bring peace to the world with that kind of investment between the wealthier parts of the world? And I'm not even speaking about the emerging economies, which are also increasingly relevant to this. And this is not that one part of the world has to finance the other. It's co-investing. If we cannot get to the point where we recognize that co-investing in one another actually yields a win-win for everyone, we will end up with these zero-sum games. And the cuts in development budgets, and I explicitly exclude the German government from this because Germany is one of a few OECD countries, others are also there in the room, that actually did the opposite in this crisis. But look at those who have walked away from their responsibility and their ability to make a difference. And that is why talking about our institutions, when at the same time we're actually in the midst of the most extraordinary crisis, having to actually work with less support is a contradiction in principle. And with that, I'm going to do a hit and run. I apologize for that, but Richard,
Thank you so much for giving us your time today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Richard Gowan, you have a keen eye on the UN for the International Crisis Group. And I want to kind of return to the initial question about what reforms need to take place in what order in order to respond to the crises with increased competition among states and all the other contexts that we've discussed.
I mean, I should start by saying that I'm one of those dreadful foreign policy people who obsess about the Security Council. So I think my bank manager would be quite surprised to discover that I'm allowed on a panel talking about banks. But, I mean, I think looking at the current moment that we're in at the UN, obviously there is a strong case for Security Council reform. We heard that from President Biden a year ago. I'm sure we're going to hear President Biden today and many other leaders talk about the need for Security Council reform. But actually, as someone who focuses on crises worldwide, I think I'm more interested in reforms to the international financial system than I am in the unicorn of Security Council reform. And the reason I say that is we at Crisis Group, we focus on the politics of crises. We focus on political actors involved in wars worldwide. But over the last couple of years, we have become more and more seized of the economics of fragility that you were describing. And what we see is a world in which economic pressures are contributing to conflict. That can take many different forms. It can be a situation such as the situation in the Sahel, where young men and women really have very limited economic opportunity, and for that reason they join armed groups. Sometimes they join jihadist groups. Or they go out on the streets and protest their governments. We're seeing a generation in many parts of Africa in particular that really feels that the system is loaded against them and are increasingly taking up radical politics in response to this situation. As the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung pointed out in a very good report, last year we're also seeing a huge increase in food protests, we're seeing an increase in fuel protests, we're seeing an enormous amount of instability. And that instability creates a very fertile ground for the coups we have seen recently, especially across the Sahel, and for other forms of political crisis. So one of the most important things we can do for conflict prevention right now is to try and get economic development back on track and try to help countries suffering under huge debt burdens in particular to sort out their public finances so they have some chance of having more constructive politics and offering their populations more opportunities so that we don't create the conditions for political crisis. In conversations around the UN over the last year, I've noticed that while diplomats do like talking about Security Council reform, I mean, it's a fun thing to talk about, and friends of mine like Richard Ponzio over there and I have discussed it for decades, with somewhat limited results. I mean, what I sense is that there is much greater diplomatic interest now in reforming the multilateral financial system. And that should be our priority, and that should be a priority as a matter of conflict prevention, as I say. So, I mean, I do hope that the political impetus that we see coming out of this week, that we hope will be echoed in Marrakesh, can lead to some of the reforms that have been described. I do think that it's important that we have some sort of timeline to achieve these goals. We shouldn't be back here in a year sort of saying we need to, we really need to push forward with this. Speed is, I think, of the essence. Yeah. Because all the indicators we have suggest that as economic pressures increase, you will see more crises, you will see more coups. We need to get ahead of that curve as fast as we can.
Since speed is of the essence, Minister Schulze, you gave us some ideas of how the system could work better, but I wish you could say a bit more about that. In particular, how the UN and the multilateral development banks can function together as more of a system.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think it is easier to say that we need to work together than to do that, because bringing an example, building social protection systems in the Sahel region, everybody knows that that is important to build resilience in the region. You need a social system that is in charge before the crisis is hitting the people. We were able to work together with 19 donors in the Sahel Alliance to build adaptive social protection systems in that region. We just started with that a few years ago. It is hard work. What we've learned in that is you have additional costs to bring donors together. And that is the same for the World Bank. We just have an agreement that the World Bank and the ILO are working together to foster social protection systems. But by doing so, they need additional money, because bringing the people together, looking at the country, saying, okay, what is ILO doing, what the World Bank is doing, that needs power, that needs people, that needs money to finance that people. And we must be aware that we need additional money for that, to bring institutions together. We do that now for social protection, because it's close to my heart as a social democrat, and this is important for Germany to foster social protection systems. But that is only one example, and we need more of that, bringing together the different knowledge of the systems. And ILO has a lot of knowledge in building the right framework for social protection systems. The World Bank has a lot of knowledge in financing such systems. We need a third partner to know how to build a financial architecture in a country that has no tax system, that has no idea which people are living in their city, in their country, what is the need of the people, how to have a first idea of how to reach the people. So bringing that knowledge together, I think that is really, really important, and that means a lot of work, and we need to be fast in that. And so the ones who finance all the system need to take into account that means giving additional money for that. And that is what I would like to raise additionally. Building resilience, I think that is the first point we need from the view of the global south. And that is what we've learned in the pandemic. If you have a social protection system, if you have a health system, you have more resilience in a society than if you don't have such systems. So building resilience, having local functioning structures of a state, that is what we need to build forward. You mentioned it, Anna, before. It's about capacity building. And yes, prevention is not sexy. It's not what everybody likes. You get no glory for it. But it is needed. And it's when we can see that after the crisis with a pandemic, that it is needed really, really quick.
Thank you. Ms. Birja, we asked Administrator Steiner about the role of the Pact of the Future. What can the multilateral development banks, and in particular the World Bank, do to help support this initiative?
So I have to say it's great to listen to the speakers, and each has got me thinking and feeling that the urgency is just more than ever. I mean, we're really kind of at a point where either we go towards relevance or we go towards irrelevance, and we're up against a difficult challenge doing that if you listen to the availability of funds and where the priorities are today. So I think we need to make the case for urgency much more, and together we need to do it. I think the opportunities that we have is to leverage each other. Yes, Minister Schulze says it will take resources. It's true, it does take resources. But we cannot continue to do our own things. And when I, again, visit clients, when I go to visit countries, they'll say, well, how does this link to what so-and-so is doing? And we're burdening them sometimes by trying to do good things for them. We're coming with our help, and then we're not coordinated. So this coordination is actually almost, it's essential for us to be able to offer something that helps lift these countries up. So I think we just need to be compelled by that my success depends on the success of others, and therefore we need to coordinate much better. Thematically, I think we all need to really address this issue of climate change. There's no other way. It's yesterday's, even last week's problem. We're not getting around it. We actually have the solutions. We need the money. We need the coordination around it. I think the World Bank has done a good job. 42% of our financing last year went strictly to, specifically to climate, but 42% is nothing. And also, if you add on that, it was out of $73 billion of World Bank funding. So it's, when we know what the amounts are so large, so we need to really coordinate around this to build resilience and adaptation for the most vulnerable. And then I just wanted to pick up on this issue of social protection and building resilience and the prevention. We know, again, what we need to do. We've done the studies, pathways to peace, drivers of fragility. We know that we need to look for certain warning signs, issues. Can we fully say this will help prevent? No. But do we need to pivot towards that to have a greater understanding? Absolutely. And when the conflict happens, we need to be there with these mechanisms of social protection and resilience building. Because if we don't have them, we're leaving people very, very vulnerable. So I think we know the solutions, we need the money. We know the approaches, we're not applying them enough on the prevention side. And I'd like to step up. And in a year from now, will we have turned a corner fully on all these enormous challenges? No, but we will have made some headway. I know that. Thank you.
The urgency of tackling the climate is certainly noted. Richard Gowan also mentioned pushback on the part of populations, and we know that the energy crisis, the cost of living crisis is one of the areas in which it's very important to get the messaging right in order to bring populations on board, because there has to be a just transition. It has to be a democratic transition. So, Mr. Gowan, how can the UN facilitate this kind of transition?
Look, so I think we have to be realistic. It is not up to the UN to tell different publics why they have to go through this transition. The politics of the energy transition, the politics of the moment we're in, means that it comes down to national leaders to persuade their national constituencies that some very tough choices are necessary to adapt to the realities that we face. I think that there is a tendency sometimes amongst national leaders to sort of say, the UN should have better messaging. But the UN should have better messaging. I think that Antonio Guterres would fully agree that the UN should improve its messaging. He's worked a lot on that with Melissa Fleming. But it really comes down to national political leadership and national leaders' willingness to communicate some very hard truths to their publics. That said, I think that the data that FES has gathered through the census shows that the UN does still have a lot of credibility, that the UN, through bringing together statistics, through bringing together projections about where we're headed, can inform national debates. I think it's a great pity that a few years ago the UN closed down a lot of its regional information centers that were often providing this sort of information to the media worldwide, but they have gone. Nonetheless, I think the UN has a very important role as a resource that national leaders can draw upon, but it does come down to national politicians.
Thank you. At this point, I would like to open up for a few questions from the audience. First, I understand that the Spanish Director General of Sustainable Development Goals, Ms. Eva de Hoyo, is here. Do we... Let's see.
Just take my microphone.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation and for the excellent panel. I'm really impressed for your interventions and agree with you in many of your ideas, and they were really inspiring. We believe that there is the need for a consensus building and an ambitious multilateral response under the leadership of and coordination of the United Nations, and we believe that's urgent. Our view is that the UN and the Multilateral Development Bank partnership for reforming the multilateral architecture is really urgent, and for this reason we want to share some and advance some thoughts. We believe that we must redouble the efforts to bring the United Nations development and those of the development banks and international financial institutions closer together, and greater understanding and dialogue between representatives of those institutions, as you have been putting forward. We also believe that the Finance for Development Forum, held at the United Nations, and we believe that needs a re-edition or a re-edition, is an inclusive space for developing countries also to sit at the table with equal voice and vote. So that must be strengthened and respond to in the following years to achieve the SDGs. We also believe that the negotiation of relevant issues related to the multilateral development banks and IMF reform should be discussed and prepared during the annual meetings, spring and autumn, and in Marrakech during the next weeks, and then further discussed and negotiated in the United Nations Forum for Development Forum. Also, I would like to take this opportunity to remind you that this afternoon, another side event organized by the European Commission and Spain on the reform of the international financial architecture will take place, and I hope you also will be able to make it. Thank you.
Thank you. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Okay, Leonard, we have one right here. And if you would kindly introduce yourself.
Of course, thank you so much. My name is Sigrun Ravet, and I'm head of the Department for Multilateral Development Banks, Sustainability and Climate at the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. And thanks so much for a really inspiring morning. And this also resonates with a lot of the things we heard at the SDG summit, where really financing and the situation we have with debt comes out so strongly. But first, I wanted to say how very pleased we are with the German contribution to the hybrid capital, and that's something that Sweden and the Nordic Baltic Group also is looking very much into to see how we could be part of that. I think for us, it's very important to focus, when now I'm talking more about the World Bank, to really add the climate ambitions very highly on the agenda of the reforms. And here I would like to get some advice from you on how we can get away from this very geopolitical notion of either poverty or climate, which, I mean, I think many of us really see that it has to go hand in hand and one thing adds to the other, but that's not the way we often speak, at least here down at the UN. So some concrete messaging about how we could actually together work on getting further on that, because I think that's spoiling a lot of the discussions that we're having for the moment. But thank you so much to all of you. Thanks.
I see in the back. Yes, if you would.
Does this work? Yeah. Hi, my name is Paula Sevilla Núñez. I work for the NYU Center on International Cooperation, and I had two questions. One of them is that we've been speaking about climate change work and poverty eradication, but we haven't mentioned inequality as much. And we know that inequality not only drives crises, fueling grievances and conflict, but also hinders our ability to respond to these crises. So we talk about gathering resources, financial resources for this moment, but we also know that we live in a moment of great wealth concentration. So my question is, how can the multilateral system engage with that question of inequality? We had mentioned briefly tax evasion and corruption, but also a series of organizations have been mobilizing around the proposal to review the SDG indicators and the shared prosperity indicators, because they currently only measure what happens at the bottom 40% rather than what is happening at the top as well. So what are some of the actions that the World Bank and international multilateral actors can take to address inequality in their work, which I know Germany has also put at the center, so we appreciate that. And the second question, which is somewhat directed also to the minister, but in general, so we are talking about mobilizing resources at the OECD, that we don't have enough, that we've only mobilized 0.6% of GDP. But domestically, for example, I come from Spain, and domestically there is a sense of that there's not enough funds even for ourselves, that sometimes we see cuts in spending in education and healthcare. So how can we change the narrative nationally to help drive more global solidarity abroad as well? Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. Yes, if you would introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks. Anna-Katharina Hornitsch, German Institute of Development and Sustainability, IDOS. It's a real pleasure listening to the discussion, and I want to thank all panelists. I also want to really commend the focus on urgency and on structural reforms in the system, as well as on preventative and preventative measures. No? And I want to ask, I mean, I fully agree with the urgency painted, and there is, of course, this crisis of trust that we that we are all confronted with within the African context, within Asian contexts, the BRICS Plus extension, the Russia-Africa summit, etc., etc. The Sahel discussions, also in reflection with the role of France. So what is Plan B? What is Plan B if the reforms within the IFIs, within the UN, do not deliver what they promise right now? And of course you will say they have to deliver, and there is no Plan B, there mustn't be a Plan B, and I fully agree. But we all know there's always a degree of uncertainty. And what is then Plan B? Thanks.
Thank you so much. Hi there, Nadara Youssef with the Global Governance Innovation Network at the Stimson Centre. Just a very quick question. Sorry, I've lost my voice in the climate march. But just a very quick question in terms of one of the things that, for example, the High Level Advisory Board report touched on in connection to your questions about the Pact for the Future was the idea of conditionality. And with the IMF, conditionality comes in sort of different spaces. But when you think about public-private partnerships, often the conversation centers around de-risking and how to channel investments through MDBs into sort of public-private partnership funding. But we often skip over the question of how do you ensure that that private funding aligns with public objectives, and how do we manage conditionality in the sense of private sector funding? So I'd be curious to see how this UN MDB sort of relationship could work towards that sort of private sector funding conditionality, recognizing that the private sector funds are going to be crucial for the road ahead.
Thank you. Any more questions from the audience? Okay, I think we can take one more.
Yes, thank you so much. My name is Angela Aquino. I'm based here in New York City. My question is regarding the issue of the rising waters around Manhattan. Right now, the current solution and recommendations of local government is basically when the water rises, let's evacuate them and put them in a gym somewhere. Is there a better recommendation from the United Nations? And would the World Bank be able to create better recommendations and solutions such as housing funding, wherein the private sectors would be able to create solutions such as housings that are around the areas that are very vulnerable to high rise flooding, and is the UN be able to work with the local government as well?
Thank you so much for these questions. We've had questions about inequality, about dealing with poverty and climate change together in unison, asking about Plan B if the reforms that are proposed do not deliver, managing conditionality. So I would like to just start with Minister Schulze, and please give responses to the questions that are of interest to you, and then we'll do a final round of your closing thoughts.
First of all, I'd like to answer the question from Sweden, how to discuss poverty and climate change. I think you were absolutely right. There are people who say that doesn't fit together. And I think we need to show by example that needs to go together. You can't fight against poverty. You can't fight against hunger. You can't change a local system of agriculture without taking into account that there is climate change. That doesn't work. It needs to go together to be sustainable and successful. And I think we need to show that. And in concrete examples, we can show that around the world that is the fact, and that we see that climate change in the agriculture sector just around the world. We need to show that, I think, by example. And that is also changing the narratives nationally. Yes, we have a lot of pressure on the budgets around the world now. And there is a saying, there's a discussion to say, we need the money first here for us and then for the world. But it isn't not us and the world. We are part of the world. And that started in the morning with the coffee that doesn't grow in Germany. It doesn't grow here. It goes around the day that we are intertwined. And we've learned during the COVID-19 pandemic that no one is safe until everybody is safe. And I think these examples are a good narrative to show we are one world. We can't separate. We are not able to say we are outside that world. It is just one world. And with that, it is easier to say why we need money for the World Bank and for the UN, because that's our UN, it's our World Bank. It's not the bank from aliens, it's ours. So I think that is a good way to go into a discussion. And building more trust, having a plan B. I think it looks like we have a restructuring or an evolution of the bank, and it goes forward or not. But the truth is, between Germany and others, we're making a lot of pressure for changing the bank, doing it faster and faster and faster. And there are others who fear that there is not enough money for their ideas, and they don't want it in that way and too fast. And then we try to find a way to get majorities for what we'd like to bring forward. So it is not that or that, it is a process we are bringing forward. And what is needed is building trust again. And that was in the past. We have made a lot of mistakes during the pandemic. Don't deliver in the pandemic the help for the African continent. That was really, really a mistake. And now we need to show that if we've learned that we build a production of vaccines, thank you, production of vaccines on the African continent, that we've learned from our mistake, that we build trust again, that we listen to each other, that we walk the talk. And we don't do so. We talk a lot, but we don't walk the talk. And doing more in that direction, I think that will build trust again, and that is something that needs time. And we need to speed up in showing that this trust, that we earned it, that we need to earn this trust.
Thank you. Very, very good questions. Let me also talk about climate and poverty. And I think it's a bit linked actually to the Plan B question, and then I'll come also to inequality. I think we're pretty convinced now that climate and poverty reduction go hand in hand. And in fact, climate and economic development can also go hand in hand. You don't have to forego economic growth because you're investing in climate. I think it's very important, as the minister says, to talk about it and talk about it with some evidence, some analytics to be able to convey. We have started and now rolled out a number of these country climate and development reports. The whole purpose of these reports is to actually bring climate advocacy and analytics together with economic growth trajectory to see how do you reconcile the two. And good news is that we find in these reports over and over again that in fact not combining the two will actually cost the economy, because ultimately economies will grow on sustainable policies. But it was important to put this research out because we had to be able to show it with evidence. Now, having said that, I do think that there is the Plan B question. The way I actually think about it is when you go to a country where there is 8% electrification rate, or 2 days of walking to get clean water, or no sanitation in the schools, or actually no roads really to get through, and you advocate for climate and you use global climate language and policies and terminology, I think you become very disconnected from the local population. And that actually gets to this issue of whether we call it global north, global south, trust, empowerment. Do we really understand what's needed and wanted at the local level? So I also think we need to be much more attuned to the needs of the populations that we're working with. And that's where I do think we still cannot forego investment in something where the climate payoff, it should never hurt the climate, but it should sometimes be there is basic development projects needed that may be on the climate dividend, not 100%, but 50%, it's still a good project. So I think we need to also very much pay attention to where a country is in its development trajectory. Never should you hurt the setback on the climate agenda, but you need to sometimes recognize what some of those local needs are. And in my experience, more and more, over and over again, we're marrying the two, because sustainable agriculture solutions are also climate-smart solutions. Energy solutions, I was just in Chad, 8-10% electrification rate. The solution is not going to be conventional energy. It doesn't work. If it worked, it would have been done by now. That's what we know very well how to do. It's going to be distributed energy, renewable energy, mini-grids, smart solutions. So we are going to see, I think, over and over again that development and climate go hand in hand. And we need these examples to go to scale. That's why I mentioned scale. On inequality, a very good point. On our vision, so we have poverty alleviation, shared prosperity gets exactly to this issue around poverty, inequality. And what we're doing, I didn't mention, but we're coming out also with a new scorecard of how to measure ourselves. How effective are we? And on that scorecard, we will measure poverty at the levels of low-income countries, high-income countries, but we also want to measure an income level threshold. And we're looking at both the median for middle-income countries and for high-income countries, and how many people are moving up towards higher income. So that's one metric, if you will, that we will use. But I also think our operations need to increasingly focus on reducing disparities. And that goes across the board, whether it's access to service, whether it's gender empowerment and equality, whether it's regional disparities, which are also often actually a cause of conflict. So this issue of inequality needs to be at the forefront, both on our metrics and our measurements, but also our interventions. And I'm very glad you raised it. Thank you.
Mr. Galvin.
I mean, on this provocative question of what is the Plan B, we know what the Plan B is. Antonio Guterres has described it quite well. It's the great fracture. What we're talking about here is technical. It's about money, but it's also deeply geopolitical. We have a choice. We can either move towards a world of increasingly separate economic blocs, in which different economic powers support various proxy states, and multilateral institutions are increasingly sidelined. Or we can try and rebase our multilateral cooperation in a way which moves beyond the North-South divide, gets to a point where everyone feels some ownership and some trust in the multilateral system and the way the multilateral system is distributing resources. That's what's at stake. You know, I think that everyone has I mean, I think the Washington Post said this was a gloomy General Assembly, and it is a gloomy General Assembly because, you know, everyone is here very aware of the divides that between the big powers, divides between North and South. It seems to me that what we're trying to do with this discussion around the SDGs, around the Pact of the Future, is try and work out some sort of guiding principles for how we keep this system together. And that's what it boils down to. And I think that there's been some promising signs coming into this week that everyone gets that, and ultimately most people want to keep the system together. So we just have to hope that Plan A works.
Well, we've come almost to the end of our program, and I want to give Minister Schulze the last word here.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining us here in the early morning for this really interesting discussion. And I think you've just heard that is a journey we were starting now. We start a journey that takes us to Marrakesh, to the World Bank's meeting, to Hamburg, to the Hamburg Sustainability Conference, and then back to New York, a journey that will last 12 months. That is not a lot of time for changing really big things, but I think we have major goals. What we heard today, an ambitious Marrakesh consensus. That is what is needed, and the preparation for a decisive summit of the future. This preparation means we need to discuss with each other. We need to hear the voices, really hear it, not only say we are hearing it, but really go in a discussion with each other. And we need to fight for a multilateral architecture. It is a decision, you're absolutely right. And I think here we agreed in the room that we want to have this multilateral system and that we fight for it. And I hear here in the room that it is important that we do not only simply think at the edges, that we go really on the ground of the problems. That is the architecture of the system that we need to bring forward again. That is we need really to make a difference. And if we do so, we are absolutely convinced that will help us to successfully beat poverty, to fight against hunger, to fight against inequality, and to renew the multilateral system. And that is, we often say we owe the future from the next generations, and we need to protect it, and we need to strengthen it. And this discussion here makes me a little bit more optimistic that we are able to do so. So thank you very much for this start in the day.
And thank you all for coming. Thanks for making the time this morning. And let's all go out and fight for Plan A. Yeah.